All right, well, good evening. Nice to see you all and those joining us online as well, and very much looking forward to our study for this evening as we basically pick up where we left off last week, and that is with chapter 6 in Eric Metaxas's book, The Letter to the American Church. Prior to that, however, let me just briefly review a few major points from last week, and actually a little bit from the preceding session as well. So in terms of the book, I had written, you might recall, a preface to it. And in that preface, I emphasized that in America today, we face a host of powerful threats that can be summarized by four very insidious agendas. First of all, secularism, of course, a godless philosophy that destroys the concept of one nation under God and in God we trust. And I would call secularism the root of all evil. Secondly is socialism, a one world authoritarian or perhaps even totalitarian governmental system. Sexualism, a sex-obsessed and thoroughly pornified society that lacks self-control as a result is so easily manipulated and controlled by government. And fourthly, racialism, an obsession with racial identity that exploits past racial injustices, that promotes current racial injustices such as affirmative action programs, and fragments society and destroys any sense of e pluribus unum, out of many one. So those four, as I say, very insidious agendas are just absolutely corrupting every aspect of American society and culture, as you know. Secularism, primarily, but then socialism, sexualism, and racialism. The American church is at a crisis point similar to that of the German church in the 1930s. And both churches, the German church in the 30s and American Christianity today, is largely silent in the face of all of this evil that we face. And Eric Metaxas has written in his book, The American Church has reached a crucial crossroads in history. However, most Christians and most churches are failing to serve as sources of light and love and hope and truth in any kind of comprehensive way whatsoever. Now, in chapter 1 of the book, What is the Church? We took a look at several comments by Metaxas that I'd like to just briefly recap. One is that the American church today is too often just absolutely culturally irrelevant. In fact, it exerts very little influence in general on our society, and in fact, unfortunately, it follows so many of the trends of our culture, and in which case its emphasis and its influence is very much neutered. The standard excuse, as we've all heard, is essentially this, quote, "Oh, we don't mix politics and Christianity, we just preach the gospel." And that's something that Eric Metaxas will especially be zeroing in on in a couple of the chapters we'll be talking about this evening. And then, of course, I always feel obligated to go back to the quote by R.C. Sproul, which I think so unfortunately is so apt in terms of describing the church in America and our situation today. And I'm sure you've heard the quote before. "I doubt if there's ever been a period in all Christian history in which so many Christians were so ineffectual in shaping the culture in which they live as is true right now in the United States." Wow, what a damning indictment, especially when you consider we're the most privileged Christians who have ever lived, privileged and prosperous for that matter. So this idea that Christians should be detached or somehow above politics and all, I mentioned that in my mind, that's tantamount to cultural pacifism, basically. And I mentioned a couple of sessions ago about the movie that came out in 2015, Hacksaw Ridge. And the bottom line there is that cultural pacifists may be very nice, very decent, honorable people in so many respects, but we have to understand, we have to come to the realization that there's a ferocious culture war going on in America. The other side understands that. They won't admit it, but they understand it very well. And they are absolutely committed to winning at all costs. Too many Christians, too many conservative Americans don't seem to get it. And so many think that we can just opt out of the culture war. But keep in mind, and this is a point that I brought out in relation to that movie Hacksaw Ridge, and that is, again, cultural pacifists may be very, very decent people, but they don't win wars. They don't even attempt to engage in wars, culture wars and otherwise. We also talked about the issue of separation of church and state and how it's been so drastically, grossly misunderstood and misrepresented throughout much of American Christian history. Now, moving on, last week, the last chapter that we covered was chapter 5, entitled 12,000 Pastors. And it takes our mind back to the 30s in Germany and the role of the Christian church in Germany at the time. And as Metaxas notes in that chapter, Dietrich Bonhoeffer realized that unless pastors and other Christian leaders address the evils of the Nazi regime, German civilization would be destroyed. Of course, it was that orientation that he set forth was eerily prophetic, of course. So among Christian leaders, there were three orientations, basically. Though there was a minority of German Protestant pastors who actively supported the Nazi regime. In other words, they put patriotism, nationalism above their Christian faith. And that was about 1 out of 6 of the German church leaders at the time. And then there were many others who passively complied with the Nazi agenda based on passages such as Romans 13, 1-7, which has been used for years and years, generations really, by Christians who think that we ought to and can opt out of any kind of civic responsibility and involvement. And 1 Peter 2, 13-17. And they'll use as the example, or they'll use as their argument that we need to comply with the government, in virtually all respects. And after all, it's all God's will anyway, say. Now, that's an argument that's so pathetic. And we can assess that on an individual level. Think about your own life. Has everything you ever said and done and thought been God's will? Well, of course it hasn't. Okay. And if that's the case on a micro level, an individual level, then it certainly is the case on a macro level as well. And now God allows, throughout human history, God has allowed horrible evil to exist and sometimes flourish for reasons we can't fathom, frankly. But to say that it's all God's will is absurd. Most of what goes on in the world, most of what's gone on in human history was not God's will, certainly not his perfect will, but in his permissive will, these things happen. So we have those who actively supported the Nazi regime, those who passively just kind of took the pacifist view and just stepped aside and complied with the Nazi agenda. And then thirdly, there were those who actively resisted the government's agenda. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was part of that group early on, Karl Barth, until he was expelled from Germany and lived the rest of the war years in Switzerland. And people like Martin Niemöller and so on, part of that group that actively spoke out and resisted the government's agenda. Now, had the German church, Metaxas says, had the German church presented a united front against the Nazi agenda, history might have been different. Unfortunately, though, most Christian leaders lacked the moral courage to stand up for biblical principles. So, for instance, we read that there were about 18,000 Protestant pastors in Germany at this time. Of the 18,000, about 3,000 were staunch supporters of the Nazi regime. About 3,000 actively opposed the Nazi regime, at least in the beginning, although many of those cracked under pressure and wound up acceding to the Nazi agenda more or less. The other 12,000, 2/3, 12,000 out of 18,000, just passively complied with the Nazi agenda. And typically, people like that would claim that they were just called to, quote, preach the gospel and not to mix it with controversial or divisive social and political issues. So we see the results, the horrific results of that kind of culture war pacifism. These pietistic Christians who think that we have an out, we can just duck and cover when it comes to great moral issues, using as the excuse biblical passages that call for obedience and submission to those in authority, such as those passages we read in Romans 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2. But of course, submission to government must never violate our allegiance to the higher laws of God, the higher spiritual and moral laws of God, such as we read about in Acts 4:19 and Acts 5:29. We must obey God rather than men. But again, it's an easy escape for those who lack the courage or the faith to confront the great evils of our time. Metaxas puts it this way. Bonhoeffer, he says, could see what lay ahead, and he knew the concessions that the church was making would be fatal in years to come. In their ignorance, in their silence and inaction and theological confusion, these church leaders were not only helping evil gain a foothold, but were also lending evil a helping hand. He goes on to note, we know what followed in Germany because of the 12,000 pastors who chose not to be political and who shrank from taking a heroic stand. The Nazis were successfully able to marginalize and openly demonize those 3,000 who strongly stood with the confessing church. So again, some of the key points that we talked about last week and even a couple of them early on the week before. Any comments or questions, anything before we move on? And so any comments from the group here in the room, just again, for the sake of those who are joining us online, just speak as loudly as possible. And we do have a new amplifier here, so hopefully that will help the people joining us online hear your comments and questions. Dan?
I was just going to quickly say that the 12,000 who were fence sitters try to keep their heads down, that doesn't work. I mean, whatever else you could say about their view, it didn't work. I mean, you know, the Nazi regime went from strength to strength until it didn't, and destroyed Germany, and then you got in the war, and the whole thing just collapsed. So there was no. So then you have to face your kids and grandkids who say, "Why didn't you speak up? How did you let this happen?" Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't even work. Even if they could just escape and just let's just move this to the back burner and look the other way. Mm-hmm. Sing a little louder, as Metaxas says. you know, but that doesn't even, it didn't even, my point is, it didn't even work.
Yeah, I think, you know, the most, perhaps the most famous recruitment campaign poster during World War I was the famous one that was crafted by someone in Great Britain. And there's a father sitting in his leisure chair, and his little girl is sitting on his lap, and his little boy is down on the floor playing with his soldiers and everything. And it occurs to the little girl to turn and ask her father, "Daddy, what was it you did in the Great War?" And you can see he's got this very pensive, you know, look on his face. And you know, as hard as that is to reconcile in terms of those that we purport to love, well, ultimately, you know, God asked the same question: what did you do in the Great War? And I think the question is perfectly applicable to the culture war that we're experiencing and have been experiencing for decades here in America.
And I would just quickly add that the Nazi, the pastors' flaccid spines in the face of Nazi aggression, that ended up being kind of a gift that kept on giving. I won't, you know, it's definitely R or X rated, so I don't recommend it. It's not a family friendly movie, I'll tell you that straight up. There's violence and nudity and much else, but there is sort of a
Jeffrey, you put yourself on mute. There.
Okay, can you hear?
Yes, now.
Did you miss everything I said up to this point? You
Not
did.
everything.
Okay, so
Just,
you,
we didn't hear the last part of what was it Dan was saying. Yeah.
okay, thank you. I didn't realize that somehow it got muted
I
again.
think when you reached for your glass, you hit it or something.
Okay,
well, good call.
thank you,
Well, anyway,
Teresa.
this movie is not a family friendly movie, but the point is that
Mhm.
when these new left radicals, the 68ers as they were known, when they started, it's basically the European version of the American Weather Underground, only more sinister and more violent. When they're blowing up banks and killing capitalists and things like that, there was actually a lot of sympathy in Germany. There are a lot of people who wouldn't rat them out, wouldn't turn them in, who thought that they were somehow doing good because they presented their cause as trying to prevent Germany from lapsing back into fascism. So we're anti-fascist, so we're okay. So we must be cool. And so yes, it's endless gift that keeps on giving once you get this thing going.
There is a time to stand up and quote fight for what's right and true and honorable and decent and civil and so on. And of course, when it comes to violence, that requires, of course, extreme careful consideration. And fortunately, it you know, it's not come to that point in America's culture war. Hopefully, it never will. But nonetheless, we need to fight with weapons of the spirit and fight wholeheartedly against all these evil influences that are just overwhelming our society and culture and everything in it. You know. Anything else before we move on to chapter 6 here? Yes.
Add on to what was said.
As loudly as you can there.
There were about 6 million Jews, I believe, is the number that Hitler rounded up. Well, there were about 5 million Germans who were also rounded up, who had been identified as being a threat to Hitler's rule, etc.
That's right.
About things they had done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever. Also, by that time, Hitler had, before he did all that, he had come the reason for why it's a good thing for people in Germany to that they give up their firearm, or they were registered, but not yet taken up, so they were, Hitler knew who had the firearms, so he went about, took those up, as well as taking over the radio station, but, you have to be prepared for the fact that it's not just that we're gonna be able to sail past everything if we don't say anything. It may just be because of who we are, or who we have been, that we get picked up and thrown in the gulag, anyway, whether we said anything
Yes.
like that or not.
Yeah, it's not just those who are actively opposed to the Nazi regime.
Yeah,
As they gained more and more power and so on, they started going after even critics, even relatively minor critics of the regime. Yeah. Well, that's how totalitarians operate, whether they're communists or Nazis or whatever the case may be. Well, let's take a look here then at chapter 6. And Bonhoeffer entitles this chapter, The Spiral of Silence. And he begins by reminding us that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is tantamount to actually speaking. Not to act is to act. God will not hold us guiltless, he says. That's on page 51 of his book. Now, the point here is that cultural pacifism, culture war pacifism, is not an option. Christians are called to be a source of salt and light in society, regardless of the consequences. Metaxas puts it this way, quote, just as cowardice begets cowardice, courage also begets courage. When we speak out, we inevitably encourage others to do so as well. Either we help evil or else we fight it. Now, a major problem in evangelicalism today, according to Metaxas, and I would largely agree with him, is what he calls the idol of evangelism. The belief that the only real role of the church is to save souls. Now, certainly, evangelism needs to be a priority, but it's not our only priority. Jesus charged us to love others as you love yourself. And this is a holistic, command by him. We realize that we can't really love another person if all we're concerned about is their religious life and their spiritual life. No, they have psychological and social and intellectual and financial needs and so on. And all of that needs to be attended to if you honestly love another person. As Francis Schaeffer emphasized in his ministry and in his writings, Christians need to integrate a comprehensive understanding of discipleship. And this would be an understanding that includes loving others as we love ourselves. We try to attend to all of our needs, don't we? Well, likewise, anyone that we truly love will attempt to do that as well. So this really calls for extending our Christian beliefs into every area of life, from our family and church involvement, of course, into every area of life, including politics as well. Because as we know, politics also is a very vital, important aspect of life. And it can be at times overwhelmingly important unless it's properly addressed. So that's basically the major points in chapter 6 there. Now, chapter 7 is entitled Two Errors of Faith. And in this chapter, Metaxas is talking about an aspect of discipleship that Bonhoeffer emphasized repeatedly, especially in his later writings, though, and that was his concept of, quote, cheap grace. Just as mainline Protestantism had turned Christianity into sterile rituals and traditions devoid of true spiritual life, modern evangelicalism reduces Christian discipleship to personal piety alone. In his translation of Romans 3:28, quote, "For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law." Martin Luther added, quote, Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith alone without the deeds of the law. Now, such a view, according to Metaxas, omits the necessity of holistic discipleship. And he quotes, for instance, in the Epistle of James, James 2:14 and James 2:18 to 26. And he comments that Luther originally wanted to exclude from his German translation of the New Testament the book of James. In fact, he only very reluctantly added it to his New Testament canon. And what he was most repelled by, what Luther was most repelled by, were verses such as the ones I just mentioned, James 2:14 and verses 18 to 26, which declare, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can such a faith save him?" James goes on to write, "I will show you my faith by my works. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Faith apart from works is dead." Now, this, we don't, this is not the proper venue getting into a theological debate over some of this, but I think you get the point, and I think it's a very, very valid point. And that is, as Metaxas put it, there is more to believing than mere intellectual assent. It is actually what we do that matters, because our actions illustrate what we actually believe. So, we have this false dichotomy between Christian orthodoxy, basic doctrines that we're compelled to believe, and Christian orthopraxy, how we live our lives. But again, his point is that that's a totally false dichotomy. How we live our lives evidences exactly what we believe. Now, we may stand up in church and sing songs, hymns that are full of biblical doctrine, and we may repeat, the Apostles' Creed and other things like that. But it's how we live our lives that really shows what we truly believe, not just words that we mouth. So in his book, The Cost of Discipleship, Dietrich Bonhoeffer called this kind of easy believism cheap grace. Likewise, American evangelicalism has cheapened the meaning of real belief and real faith. And this is what Metaxas says on pages 63 and 64 in his book. Quote, "We have reduced belief to mere intellectual assent. If someone today is asked what he believes, that person might direct us to read the statement of faith on the website of the church they attend. But God sees our hearts, and he sees our actions. God knows precisely what we believe by the way we live our lives." Wow. Be taken very, very seriously and soberly, isn't it? He goes on to note, God isn't interested in what we claim to believe, but in what we actually believe. He sees our hearts and observes our actions. When the German church in the 1930s and the American church today focus on doctrinal statements, but forget that we are obliged to live out what we claim to believe, we make a mockery of what God actually requires of us. We really make a mockery of the Christian faith. So Dolly and I went to England several weeks ago, and on our flight over there, we were searching for something worthwhile to watch, to occupy our time. So we came across a movie called Irina's Vow. Has anybody seen that, by the way? Oh, good. So you have seen it. Anyone else? Okay, I would highly recommend it. It's called Irina's, I-R-E-N-A, Irina's Vow. It's a movie that was made in 2023, and it's set in Poland during World War II. And a Nazi major in one of these scenes asks his Polish housekeeper, a woman named Irina, who is secretly hiding Jews, by the way, he asks her, quote, "Tell me about your family. I want to know who you are." He's very impressed by her character, and she's a very good worker and so on. And so he's actually kind of falling in love with her. And so he says, tell me about your family. According to the Germans, the Poles were an inferior race and all, but he's quite impressed by this woman. So tell me about your family. I want to know who you are. And Irina, who of course has no respect for this fellow because he's part of the Nazi establishment, she responds, why? Why do you want to know? And he says, because I'm interested. I want to know who you are. And her response is great. Her response is, well, what I do is what I am. What we do is who we are. It's not what we profess that we are. It's not what we profess that we are. Who we are is confirmed by how we live. Brilliant response. So you want to know all about me and who I am? Well, observe how I live my life. Of course, he doesn't realize she's harboring, a dozen or two Jews at the time. So great movie, by the way. I'd highly recommend it. Irina's Vow. Well, in chapter 8 of the book, the title of this chapter is The Church Paralyzed. And the point here is, what is true faith? And several statements are made at the outset. Belief in God is more than just intellectual assent. It means that we trust God and we live in such a way as to serve him wholeheartedly. True belief is not simply repeating a rote prayer, including the Lord's Prayer, for instance, or some kind of early church creed. And regarding the Lutheran principle of faith alone, as Martin Luther, so actively enforced and taught and wrote about so much of his career, Metaxas writes, God is not interested in what we say we believe. He demands from us the wholehearted and passionate devotion of a lover. Intellectual assent is not merely insufficient, it's actually offensive to God. God is looking for everything we have to give for our whole selves. God is not satisfied or fooled by what we say we believe any more than the devil is fooled by what we say we believe. Good point, isn't it? Devil's not fooled either. Or any more than our neighbors are fooled, or our friends or enemies. People see precisely what we believe by how we live our lives, how we behave. And then he addresses the issue of cheap grace. And he emphasizes that cheap grace is imitation faith. Real faith inevitably leads to good works, to loving others, as we love ourselves, loving the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving others as we love ourselves. And Metaxas writes, and this is something that's actually quoted in Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, quote, I can go and sin. This is the attitude so many Christians apparently have. I can go and sin as much as I like, and I can always rely on God's grace to forgive me. I can therefore cling to my bourgeois secular existence and remain as I was before, with the added assurance that the grace of God will cover me. As a result of this kind of thinking, the Christian faith has been secularized, Metaxas says. The antithesis between the Christian life and a life of bourgeois respectability is at an end. Again, these are the words of Bonhoeffer. The upshot of it all is that my only duty as a Christian is to leave the world for an hour or so on Sunday morning, go to church, and be assured that my sins are forgiven. I need no longer try to follow Christ, for cheap grace, the bitterest foe of discipleship, which true discipleship must loathe and detest, has freed me from that. So again, quoting from Bonhoeffer, and that is, the Christian life, true Christianity, true spiritual Christianity is not just, sacrificing an hour or two of your life once a week on Sunday mornings. And other than that, pretty much living like the rest of the world. Not at all. So Metaxas goes on to comment that by the time Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote The Cost of Discipleship in 1936, quote, he could see the monstrous reality that this kind of cheap grace had wrought in his country. They were already well past the point of no return. Many Christians are arguing that the upcoming election very well could be America's point of no return. When you look at all of the corruption and damage that has been done just in the last 4 years, we very well may be on the precipice of absolute disaster, which is why, again, we need to take the upcoming election with utmost seriousness, do everything that we can to try and reverse the course that this nation is on presently. And again, whether you like the Republican candidate or not, there are great issues at stake. And there's an awful lot of evil that needs to be confronted and refuted. It may be too late after this election comes and goes. Why do we think that as American Christians, we're entitled to continue to live as the most privileged, prosperous Christians in all of world history? Where do we get that notion?
Good question.
Yeah.
In the Constitution that protects freedom of religion,
Yes.
but it's not being observed.
There is so much at stake, isn't there?
So I mean, we do have legal protection to live out our faith, but these days it's not protected.
Yeah. There's certainly a lack of concern and emphasis in the present administration. Now, we know both political parties are very flawed. We know these candidates, to say the least, are very flawed. But there are great principles and policies at stake, and we need to understand that those transcend the individual candidates and their personalities, and even, we hate to say it, but these great issues even transcend these candidates' character. Okay, so we need to think like adults. So many Christians and so many Christian leaders are thinking like children. And that is, they're going to vote, if they vote at all, they're going to vote according to which candidate they, quote, like the more, which one has the nicer personality, and so on. And we know how childish that is. I mean, that's exactly how children assess other people. As adults, we're called to a much higher standard, aren't we? And there's great issues at stake in this upcoming election. And that has to be the basis on which we focus. Dan? Yes.
I won't make another Megan Basham presentation. I'm still only about halfway through the book, but it is quite a damning report. And again, most of the flaws in the book.
Oh, the book. Tell us the title of the book.
Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. And she documents how quite a number of what are known as Big Eva, the evangelical establishment, the same sort of mob that Francis Schaeffer once warned us about in his 1984 book, one of the last books he wrote, The Great Evangelical Disaster. There's this sort of axis of, I won't call it evil, but there's an axis of limpness and flaccid responses. So you have Christianity Today magazine, the National Association of Evangelicals, colleges like Wheaton, things like that, where InterVarsity Press, organizations like that have disappointed Christians for a generation. anyway, so Megan Basham's book, I really kind of view it, they really should sell it in a 2-volume set with Schaeffer's book, The Great Evangelical Disaster. But anyway, I won't make a report on the book because I'm only about halfway through, except to note, you asked the question, why do Christians think that we can get away with this? Why do Christians think that nothing's at stake? And one of the things that you notice in her book, and I'm sure Schaeffer's book as well, is that these evangelical leaders who feel perfectly safe to endorse policies and principles and personalities who are destructive, is that they're fat and happy. They're in a comfortable spot. Their job doesn't visibly seem to depend on the things that they say. They get paid whether they promote good or evil. And so I think that has a limited sell-by date. There's an expiration date to that. And so a lot of Christians who are comfortable, they just think, oh, well, I live in this, in or near a gated community. I can go down to the mall, I can go to Zaxby's and go to the drive-through and drop my kids off, and they have this complete existence. And here's what they're not realizing, these Christians, and certainly these Christian leaders that she and Schaeffer writes about, what they're not realizing is that their whole society, their whole civilization, America in particular, as sort of an experiment out in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere before any of this stuff was built, right? It was an experiment based on a certain set of ideas. And if you trash the ideas and go with a different set of ideas, you get a different reality. So pretty soon you don't have a crossover SUV with triple air conditioning, and pretty soon you don't have an Applebee's to go to. And so there's this giant illusion that I'm not saying me personally, but the illusion for the Christian or a Christian leader who wants to wander off the reservation or not really pay any attention to ideas and the flow of ideas and history. You're a historian, so you know these things, but they don't really see that America is basically, they see the hardware, they don't see the software. They don't see that there's a set of ideas that they're riding around on, that their house, their air conditioning, their heat, the fact that they can telephone for somebody and they come and fix the plumbing, all of that is sitting on a set of ideas about the human nature, about, freedom of expression, freedom of commerce up to a point, within reason. All of these things are ideas. And so if you trash those ideas, if you swap out those ideas for a different set of ideas, you get Venezuela or Cuba pretty quickly.
Right, Kamala Harris is out there talking about price fixing at the grocery store, and I can't believe nobody pushes back on her, or just comments to say, well, isn't that gonna result in a shortage of goods, and soon
They don't see the relationship.
soon there won't be any milk or butter for anybody to buy at any price.
They don't see that relationship at all. They don't know anything about economics.
Let's go figure.
Yeah.
The reason is because our public is uneducated.
Or worse, mal-educated.
They go through public school for 12 years, those kind of things. What price fixing Nixon did down on gasoline in the 70s, and it was a disaster. But they are not taught our free enterprise principles. They're not taught our financial system, the Federal Reserve Act, what it does. They're not taught Marxist dogma, the economics of that, and price control, government control. They have no idea what that is, and therefore they're not able to think and conclude for themselves. Rather, they have to depend on somebody else's opinion of what to do and what not to do, how to vote, because they're uneducated.
Grossly miseducated or uneducated, and this has been going on, of course, for a century, at least a century, and this plays into the Marxist projections 100 years ago of the long march through the institutions here in America. Takes us back to the founding of the Frankfurt School in Germany and the Marxist influences in America at the time. And so while they have been fighting ferociously, sometimes at great personal sacrifice, for this culture war, so many Americans, so many Christians have just been totally apathetic and asleep. And so it took a few decades, but eventually they take over most all of the major, segments of influence, including schools and so on. So they've won by default because Christians and conservatives in general have been unaware or distracted, just out making money and, pursuing materialism and so on, without any thought as to what is going on with the moral state of our society and culture.
And not realizing how quickly that will all come to an end.
It can fall apart very, very rapidly. We have plenty of examples in history of that being the case. Great civilizations, sometimes that lasted for several centuries, and then very, very rapidly, just absolutely as a result of inherent rot, eventually just collapsing in a matter of a few short years.
That's what the enemy is after.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and again, they're winning by default, aren't they? Yeah. Now, by the time Bonhoeffer, as I said, wrote The Cost of Discipleship, that was in 1936. As I mentioned, he could see the monstrous reality of what this doctrine of cheap grace in our churches had wrought in his country, a country that had been very proudly Christian a couple of centuries earlier, and really in the forefront of the Protestant Reformation and so on. But by the 19th century, Germany was really in the forefront of westernized secularism, and they're beginning to reap the consequences here by the 1930s. Metaxas puts it this way on page 73 in the book. But here is the greatest horror, he says. Bonhoeffer's words are an indictment of American evangelicalism today. So his critiques of the German church in the 30s, according to Metaxas, are so very appropriate for what's going on in evangelical Christianity today. Pretty sobering thought. And I'm afraid that most church leaders are just absolutely clueless, have no idea what they're talking about here. All right, well, let's move on here to chapter 9. Chapter 9 is entitled The Idol of Evangelism. Now, you wouldn't see a title like this in a book written by an evangelical Christian very, very often, would you? The Idol of Evangelism. And the point here again is emphasizing the need for comprehensive discipleship that incorporates every aspect of our lives, not just our, quote, religious or spiritual lives. In addition to preaching cheap grace, contemporary evangelicalism also propagates a second error, according to Metaxas, and that is the idol of evangelism. True spiritual conversion should result in comprehensive discipleship that encompasses every area of life. Evangelicalism, though, has oftentimes endorsed the idea that the only thing that matters is, quote, a saving faith in Jesus Christ. But here's how Metaxas addresses that. He says, but if we adopt this myopic and unbiblical view, we will essentially be paralyzed, unable to do any of the many things that God is calling us to do, reducing faith and belief to some thin intellectual assent that misses the heart of what it means to love God with our whole being. We have similarly reduced the gospel to convincing someone to assent to God's simple plan of salvation. If we are able to get that person to pray a certain prayer, the sinner's prayer and so on, for spiritual laws and so on, we think that we have done all that's needed and we can move on from there. We can dispense with fighting for justice or for other social and political implications of the Christian life. God calls us, he says, sometimes to speak even truth to power. Now consider Jesus's public protest when he overturns the tables of the money changers in the temple and he drives out the animals with a whip. Too many Christian leaders today, though, are fearful of confronting evil. They refuse to say anything that might be construed as being controversial or judgmental or political for fear of offending others. Now, a good example came up just 2 or 3 weeks ago on a Sunday evening in a very prominent church here in Metro Atlanta, in which the pastor attempted to clarify his and presumably what the church's position on political involvement should be. It was met by those who were in attendance who are knowledgeable about these matters. It was basically mirroring the same mentality that I just mentioned. And that is, as Christians, apparently, we need to be concerned primarily that we're perceived as being nice, okay? Don't say anything controversial or judgmental or political for fear that we might offend somebody. Now, I don't remember the verses in particular. Go to Luke chapter 12. It's a long section near the end of that chapter. And apparently, Jesus never bought into this mentality that our purpose here in life is to avoid anything controversial, judgmental, or political. Look at what Jesus has to say by those who were opposing his ministry at the time, including the religious leaders of his day.
What were you when all men speak well of you?
Yeah,
He
absolutely.
doesn't seem to present that as a goal.
No, to say the least. So here's how Metaxas states it on page 79 in the book. Quote, "We hear over and over of pastors who have taken this tack with tragic results. In other words, not confronting evil, even things like the LGBTQ agenda, abortion. I mean, there are so many pastors that are afraid to even address those issues. So you can imagine their mentality when it comes to, politics in general. So again, we hear over and over pastors who have taken this tack with tragic results. The tattoos and the skinny jeans and smoke machines and the celebrities in the green rooms are not quite enough to bring people to Jesus. At some point, we may be required to actually say something that causes people to stop nodding along and might even cause them to get up and walk away." He goes on to say, and this is on pages 80 to 81 in the book, "The idol of evangelism," which is, of course, really an idol of false evangelism, was a great part of what silenced the church in Germany in the 1930s. We only want to preach the gospel, many pastors say. So rather than potentially be thrown into prison for speaking the truth of God, the whole truth of God, they kept their mouths shut, hoping the Nazis would leave them in peace. In retrospect, we see how unbelievably foolish that was. Now, what are we going to say in retrospect about what's going on in evangelical Christianity in a few years here in America? But did it ever occur to them, he says, that if God allowed them to go to prison or to a concentration camp for obeying him, perhaps he had someone in those places to whom he was sending them to witness to? Bonhoeffer shared his faith with innumerable souls in the prisons and concentration camps in which he labored his last year, and then later on in the other places to which he was taken before his death. Many testified after the war that he was very courageous and really inspired and, bolstered the courage of people that he had the opportunity to witness to in these concentration camps. Those who fail to show true agape love, self-sacrificial love, by risking all they have for those who are suffering, people like that are not true Christians. They're hypocrites and frauds. Metaxas goes on to say, if one did not have the guts to speak against the great evils being committed against the German Jews under Hitler, one had abdicated the right to worship God. Have no right to worship God if we don't live for God and uphold the truth of God. Many have heard the story. Now, this may be an apocryphal story, we're not really sure, but many have heard the story of Germans in churches being told to sing louder so as to drown out the cries of the Jews passing by in cramped railroad boxcars on their way to concentration camps. Supposedly, there were churches that reported after the war that they were holding a church service and they heard another train come by loaded with Jews and others bound for concentration camps, with all the wailing and crying and agony that they could hear, you know, as this train passed by. And the admonition of the pastor was, okay, let's sing louder, okay, so as to drown out these cries of anguish. He goes on to say, now we don't know if this story is true, but we certainly understand the gist of it. Metaxas relates how he recently attended the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, in which, quote, a prominent American pastor, get this, a prominent American pastor shared how proud he was not to have ever said anything so controversial that he might in any way be canceled or lose his opportunity to preach the gospel. Well, we know that's going on in Canada. You know, supposedly one of the freest countries in the world, Canada. Well, preaching against the LGBTQ agenda and so on, it's considered hate speech. And I'm sure, you know, probably most Canadian pastors, including those who consider themselves evangelicals, have, you know, agreed to not address these controversial issues for fear of losing their position in the church and perhaps even thrown into jail, thrown into prison. So here you have this pastor at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention talking about he is so proud that he's never said anything that was so controversial as to cause him to lose the opportunity to preach the gospel. Metaxas puts it this way: this man had such a theologically narrow view of what it means to preach the gospel. It never occurred to him that he was helping the enemies of freedom. He was also helping the enemies of the gospel. It never occurred to him that by playing such a game, he was making it more difficult for people in a free society to speak the truth. When your pastors don't stand up, who are supposed to be your spiritual leaders, when they don't stand up and speak the truth, for so many Christians, you know, that gives us, you know, an out as well. Metaxas then goes on to conclude this particular chapter with the admonition, our responsibilities of Christians go well beyond mere evangelism. On what issues, he says, are we being silent? And why are we being silent? The unborn are being murdered and their body parts are being sold for profit. Very young children in schools are being fed pernicious ideas on the subjects of sexuality. Can you imagine trying to sexualize elementary school children. Older children are being so confused by sexual activists that they agree to have their bodies mutilated so that they can never become the men and women that God created them to be. Socialistic and communistic ideas are being pushed everywhere. These will end up harming the poor more than anyone else, by the way. Are we really to keep silent about all of these things? He concludes by saying, no one cared more about evangelism than, for instance, William Wilberforce back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in England. But Wilberforce also cared about the Africans suffering in that abomination called the transatlantic slave trade. So he did everything he possibly could to speak out in their favor and worked in every way possible to end the slave trade. And eventually he succeeded with the help of other very wise, courageous Christians. Shall we forget that innumerable people in his day told him that he should not mix faith and politics? For so many in the British establishment, speaking out against the slave trade, well, that's just politics. And, it's inappropriate to address issues like that in church. And frankly, it's even inappropriate to address, venerable traditions like slavery in Parliament as well. Let me pause here and comments. Yes.
A couple of weeks ago, you were quoting from James Davison Hunter, the sort of evangelical establishment professor of sociology at Virginia State. Where is he?
Oh, no, he's at University of
University
Virginia.
of Virginia.
Yeah.
Sorry, I get those confused. Anyway, a lot of the people in Megan Basham's book partake of sort of I don't know if you want to call it, not a stratagem or a strategy. It's sort of a framework that to me is sort of like everybody's heard the parlor joke, if you stop beating your wife, there's no good answer, right? You're setting up a framework that traps the person who you're being spoken to. Well, the framework that Basham identifies over and over, and I think some of this goes back to James Davison Hunter, is the accusation that conservative Christians who want to change things or push back against the culture, that we're seeking power. We want power over others. But somehow that description is only applied to conservative Christians, the evangelical left, the religious left, the progressive Christians. Those people are completely fine. David French just endorsed Kamala Harris.
Mhm.
He's no longer willing to
Remind us who he is, David French.
Well, that will take a while, but yeah, that would take a while. But,
Well, in one sense.
former conservative columnist and very well known. He was at National Review and became a never Trumper at National Review, and today he writes for the New York Times, but he also has his own website, the Dispatch, I believe it's called. He's a very influential person, and
but he's best known for having spoken at an Areopagus forum.
well, there's that
Several
too.
years
Yes,
ago.
that was quite a while ago, and he has
Before I knew
this thing.
much about him.
And I can understand if he's reticent to vote for Donald Trump. We talked about that, but now he's gone completely. He's dropped the other shoe, and now he wants to cast a positive vote for Kamala Harris. Well, that's absolutely his American right. But my only point actually is simply that Kamala Harris also wants to exercise power. In other words, how is it that only voting for one people on one side of the aisle, if you want to vote for those people, somehow you're aspiring to have power over the American people, and you want to make them bend to your will, but somehow the other side of the aisle, no, they don't want to do that. No,
And they haven't been doing that.
no,
last
we
3.5
would
years.
never do that. We would never double down on persecution. Well, I was thinking more pointed things like the Obama administration's repeated attempts to fine and jail innocent Catholic nuns who declined to be complicit in artificial contraception and abortion on the ACA, the HHS mandates, the Health and Human Services mandates in the so-called Affordable Care Act. yeah, they were, Eric Holder and Obama both, they doubled down, repeatedly doubled down and did everything they could to threaten these young women or old women or whatever with fines and jail. And so somehow that's not exercising power over others.
Yeah.
Only voting to end that is exercising power. So that's just, it seems completely illegitimate, which means it's not just a moral case we have against these people. It's like they're dumb as dirt. They don't have an intellectual argument to make, which is disappointing because they present themselves with they wave their credentials around. Oh, I have a PhD from this school and I did this and I taught here. And yet they don't seem to be able to reason their way out of a wet paper bag.
It works on most of the American public.
Well, when, going back to, we were talking about the corruption of the education system, well, the journalism in America as well.
The
They,
ability to think
yeah.
for yourself,
mhm,
to, how to use logic
mhm.
and how to see through it and not allow yourself to be influenced by some
Yeah.
Marxist smear campaign.
They don't even know what Marxists mean.
They,
You can throw that term
they're
around,
so
they don't.
totally dominant in media and other key areas of cultural influence and so on. And there is a total double standard, but it's rarely ever pointed out and addressed because they're pretty much in control of public discourse, with a few exceptions, of course. Donna, and then there's a couple of comments here online.
But no, very, very quickly, just for those who don't know, David French does profess to be a Christian.
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
he,
yeah.
very
That's the key
definitely.
here, for those that
Mhm.
don't know.
Well, and we talked in the
Yeah.
past about David French, people like Timothy Dalrymple, people like Russell Moore. All of these are very, very influential evangelicals.
In all this.
And Megan Basham refers to all three of those in her book and many others as well. And they are, I'm sure if you were to ask them, are you pushing a secular left-wing agenda, they would deny it. But I think that would be quite disingenuous on their part because basically they are, at least in the upcoming election, allied with secular left-wing agenda. So, and it's out of hostility toward Donald Trump and his personality, and we understand all that. And that's why we have to come back to, look, we need to transcend all of that. There's more important issues at stake. Well, Janet Verba, a comment a few minutes ago, we must stand up and speak the truth regardless of the consequences. And Janet, of course, teaches in a public high school in Cobb County. And we know her well, and we know that she's had to contend with an awful lot in her work and so on. And Janet is a person of courage who does just that. She speaks up for what's right and true and all. And we have great admiration for her. Here's another comment.
Yeah, I wanted to share that. Today I'm home because there's no school in session. And I saw this commercial a couple times on Fox. And it's just a black screen putting statistics, but it's students for Life in Action. And they're letting you hear the sound of an abortion happening, of a live baby being aborted. And they put up just 2 or 3 facts, like one fact that one doctor, 8 babies that were supposed to be aborted were born alive and then put to death. So these women are courageous. I put the website on the chat because they're speaking up for the truth. And sometimes the truth is harsh, but it needs to be heard. So like every time I heard that, even my dog would be like, what is that? And if you listen, you can hear the suction and you can hear a baby. But the truth needs to be known, what's happening to these innocent lives, these God created beings that were meant to have life.
Yeah. And as I recently wrote in part 2 of this 3-part series on the upcoming election, I guess you've seen that and hopefully read it already. But we'd prefer not to talk about this, but it is the Democratic Party that is the driving force in this whole evil agenda, and has been for many decades. Now, there's also a lot of Republicans who lack the courage to stand up and resist and fight this. But these initiatives are universally from the Democratic Party, and primarily the extreme left wing of the Democratic Party. So that's just the truth. And we need to value the truth regardless of how partisan it makes us sound. Now, Janet, again, just to remind you, Janet's referring to the Students for Life Action, studentsforlifeaction.org. And Janet wrote a few minutes ago, I saw their commercial on Fox a couple of times. This is Fox Television, I guess. A couple of
Yeah, the regular Fox News station.
Yeah. Okay. I saw the commercial on Fox a couple of times, hearing an abortion being done, about 8 babies born alive and then killed. It's highly disturbing, but young pro-lifers speaking up about the truth of abortion. And, we all wish that we didn't have to talk about such matters, but that's reality, and we have to deal with reality as it is. Oh, yes. Well, I'm going to talk briefly about one other chapter, but go ahead. This is a good time for a comment.
We've kind of got to the point where we are responding to this, but this is something that's been in the works for 50, 60 years, if not 70 years. If you go back to a guy named Marcuse, who's Angela Davis' mentor, for USC, he said that in order for you to have a revolution, you have to have a spiritually, I'll say, depraved or spiritually depraved and politically barren culture in order for you to create a situation where you can overthrow whatever is existing there. And this is just straight what the conditions that you have to create in order to destroy that which is, to replace it with what you want. That's called creative destruction.
Unburdened by what it was gone before.
Well, then you're quoting Karl. That's a quote from Karl Marx. So he said a little different. We have to move forward into the future, unburdened by what has been. And his point was, we have to be unburdened by the capitalism of the bourgeoisie so the proletariat can rise. So, that's the kind of stuff that we hear. AOC has a phrase that she used. Let's go out, we have a world to win. That's the last line of the Communist Manifesto. They're not trying to hide these things, they're there in plain sight in that regard. The idea of actually entering and taking over our schools and our institutions and infiltrating that way was a plan that was laid out well back by the USSR on how to take over the country. These are not secrets.
Yeah.
They're really not, but you won't hear about them.
Well, I think maybe my favorite quote from Karl Marx was, everything that exists needs to die. And he's talking about Western civilization. And of course, in particular, probably the Christian influences on Western civilization. And so that in a nutshell, I think is the leftist Marxist agenda. Everything that previously existed needs to die so we can build a new secular utopian globalistic society and culture. But first we have to destroy everything that's been in effect.
No, one of the bizarre things is that there's a movement among universities to have innovation centers to create startups, new companies. And they call it creative destruction. That's a direct quote from Marx. So, I mean, how in the world are you saying you're having a startup called creative destruction? In other words, the purpose is first destroy that which is to start up your business. That's the very model of what they're using.
Well, they've exceeded or succeeded far beyond any expectations over the last century. Again, because they've met so little opposition. Well, let's take a look at chapter 10 here real briefly, and that will close us out for this session. Chapter 10 is entitled, as you see there in your notes, your outline, Speaking the Truth in Love. And here in this chapter, Metaxas is in particular focusing on sexuality and abortion. Starts out by referencing John 8:31-32, in which Jesus says, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, if you abide in his word. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Also, we reference Ephesians 4:15, speak the truth, but do it in love. And by the way, how we speak the truth oftentimes has a very strong influence on whether it's going to be tolerated and received or not. There's no excuse for speaking the truth outside of in hate or condemnation or whatever. In Romans 12:18, the Apostle Paul commissions us, if possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Very, very wise counsel. Likewise, in Hebrews 12:14, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and be holy. So we should be peacemakers in the true sense, but we also understand that we must speak the truth and speak the truth in love. We need Christians and Christian leaders who stand boldly and unequivocally for the truth as it relates to all areas of life, including, of course, human sexuality, which is really one of the cutting-edge issues of our time. Metaxas puts it this way: where are all of the leading American pastors today on the issues of sexuality and transgender madness? Are they afraid to speak? Do they not know that God has appointed them to speak on these issues and do it fearlessly? Goes on to say, Genesis declares that God created us male and female in his image. Everyone in the world knows that a rooster cannot lay an egg and that a man cannot have a womb and cannot menstruate or give birth or lactate or be a mother, even if we wanted to, apparently. Who would? But who will say it? Who will help lead the way through the carnage of this ideological warfare? Who will hold up the battle standard, which is Jesus himself, so that others can see it and follow? Sexual relations are exclusively for men and women who are committed to a lifelong marriage. Lewis, in his brilliant, Christian apologetic, Mere Christianity, made that point that according to biblical standards, sexual relations have to be contained to a man and woman in a marital relationship. And I like the way he comments on that in Mere Christianity. He says, this is probably the most unpopular Christian doctrine in all of Scripture, but it's nonetheless true. So just as the LGBTQ+ agenda is ungodly, so are premarital and extramarital sexual relations. And yet, when was the last time you heard a sermon on that? Abortion also, he turns his attention to abortion. Abortion is a grave sin. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes in his book Ethics, quote, destruction of the embryo in the mother's womb is a violation of the right to live, the right to life, which God has bestowed upon this nascent, this fetus. To raise the question whether we are here concerned already with a human being or not is merely to confuse the issue. The simple fact is that God certainly intended to create a human being, and that this nascent human being has been deliberately deprived of life. This is nothing but murder. And as we always say, you know, for those who doubt that it's human, well, you know, if you're not aware of that right now, just let it live. And guess what? They always come out as humans, don't they? You know, they never come out as rabbits or squirrels or sticks. Christians should provide a loving and supportive community for pregnant women who are in difficult situations relationally, emotionally, and financially. And of course, there are just wonderful organizations to which we really, you know, need to be supportive of, including the one here in Cobb County, First Care Women's Clinic, which does an excellent job. And but I noticed, you know, we've gone to the, well, in fact, Teresa's there online. I see Teresa. Teresa's very involved in First Care Women's Clinic. And we've gone, I think, at Teresa's invitation to the last two annual, you know, annual fundraisers and all. And they have been absolutely excellent. By the way, the one 2 years ago, the featured speaker was Eric Metaxas. And so we hold that organization in very, very high esteem and all. But I've noticed that even in many pro-life groups, as committed as they are to stopping child murders through abortion, rarely ever is the issue of sexual promiscuity addressed. And I believe, if I'm right, that's pretty much the origins of all of this, isn't it? And yet rarely is it addressed in churches, and even among some or many perhaps pro-life groups as well. Just quite the result of the radical sexual revolution of the 1960s and beyond. So, well, for time's sake, let's end at this point. Are there any comments, any other comments quickly or questions before we close things out? Yes, Dan?
I didn't bring my copy of the book tonight, but Metaxas may cover this in the book, but actually his wife founded, I believe, and ran for many years. I think she stepped back from leadership, but she I believe, founded and also ran a crisis pregnancy center in Manhattan or thereabouts in New York.
I think you're right. Yeah. And one of our board members, Randy Huff lives down in Peachtree City, and his wife, Lucy, headed up the pro-life organization down there, and that provided a lot of care to pregnant women who were really struggling with this issue and all. So, well, anything else? The next chapter, by the way, chapter 11, we'll start there next week. Be Ye Not Political is what it's entitled. And in that chapter, he'll emphasize that the church is really the last bastion for justice, for decency, and for civility, if it lives up to its calling to be such. So very much looking forward to that. And I believe we'll probably finish the book in our overview next week, and then we can finish up our course a couple of weeks thereafter with some other selected topics as well. Anything? Dan?
Well, I'm taking all the air in the room and stuff, but in case we're all despairing of what could we possibly do, and I'm just one person and all those sorts of things, there is a friend of the Areopagus who has attended many of Jeffrey's classes, and I won't give her name, but she felt led of the Lord, if that's not too pious an expression, she felt led of the Lord to go to this one abortion clinic on a Friday night. They don't do abortions on a Friday night. She felt led to go there to pray. And pretty quickly, this car pulls up, and it's a couple, an abortion-minded couple, that have an appointment there the next day, and they just wanted to make sure they knew where it was and how to get there to speed their journey the next day. Well, our Areopagus friend got in conversation with this couple, and the conversation went on for quite some time. And they ended up choosing life, and they subsequently named the daughter that was born after our Areopagus friend. And so that girl is now 12 or 13 and walking around with our friend's name on her. So, yeah, so there are differences that we can pick our oar in the water sometimes and push the boat a little farther down the creek, you know?
Oh my, and there are so many stories similar to that we read about. Bless her.
Amen.
Amen. Well, Chuck, would you mind closing us out in prayer?
Sure.
And again, thank you, those of you joining us online, and look forward to finishing our study of the Metaxas book next week.
Sure. Father in heaven, we thank you for the freedom yet to meet and to discuss your word in areas where just north of us that's not possible. We pray for this country and its leaderships. We pray for revival. We understand that it is your will that guides what we do, but it is your will that decides what will happen. We give thanks once again for Jeffrey, and we ask that you bless him too as he continues to teach us, and that we take all these matters to heart in your spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Thank you all.